Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our wonderful History Talk series. Today, I'm pleased to again welcome Carrie Howlett, who is a conservator of furniture, decorative arts, and architectural materials. And Carrie's the former Director of Conservation for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. We're going to continue our discussion today about our 1741 Sounding Board, this time talking about the conservation of the piece. Carrie, welcome back, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
We talked in our last piece a little bit about the history. So now I want to hear about your process with the conservation. Why did the sounding board first lose its original painted and gilt surface?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we don't exactly know why. We know that it was painted over, and the first real reference to the sounding board was in a publication of the Vestry book in 1874. And in the introduction to that Vestry book, it's describing the interior of St. John's Church. And the intro states, the original pulpit, which is said to have been brought from England, that was obviously a mistake, is still in use. The form of a star with woods of different colors, but it is at present painted white. So we know that as of 1874, it was painted white. And obviously the way this is worded, the way this is written, it's obviously probably 2 or 3 generations, it's kind of a legend that goes back probably at least two generations from the time of this writer's words. And obviously he got some things wrong because it's not a star, it's a sun. And it's not so much different colored woods. There's one exposed wood, but it's basically paint and gold and walnut. But we know it was painted by 1874. It was probably painted much earlier than that. And we can only speculate as to why that might have been painted. And again, in my earlier discussion, I mentioned what I see as somewhat of relation to Freemasonic symbology. In the early 19th century, there was a very, very strong anti-Masonic movement. It was essentially led by people in the Christian church who viewed the Masonic movement as being a godless movement, which it really was not. I think in France, was always sort of an atheistic movement, but in the American colonies, it was definitely largely Christians who were members of it, but they viewed themselves, they viewed Freemasonry as something that sort of superseded Christianity in a way. It was more universal than Christianity. But at any rate, there was a really, really strong anti-Masonic movement in the early 19th century. And, if we're looking for some sort of philosophical reason for why it might have been covered over, that may be the case. It's also entirely possible that it just got very dark, or the gilding started flaking off, or it started looking very bad, aged or deteriorated in some way, and they just decided to cover it over. So we don't really know, but we can certainly speculate.
Tell me what obstacles you ran into. I can think of one, and that would be the weight of the piece and the size of it. At least from my perspective, that made me super nervous taking it down and putting it up.
It was a job taking it down and putting it back up, but one of the things that I think is fascinating about it is that it looks very heavy when you look at it up above the pulpit there. It looks very, very sturdy, very, very heavy. It's kind of fascinating to me is that it's actually built in a very lightweight way. That is, the cornice, it's a very, very heavy built-up cornice, but it's built out of very thin pieces of wood. And it really reminds me of some of the bed cornices that you see on some of the really great 18th century English beds from the great houses in England, where they have this very massive, what looks like very massive heavy cornice, but it's actually very, very lightweight construction. So it really is fascinating that they're able to get that feeling of heft using very lightweight structure. The sounding board and the cornice are made entirely, structurally made entirely of good old southern yellow pine. That was first and foremost the reason why it's pretty obvious that it was not imported from England, as was surmised in 1874. It's definitely a production from Virginia. Beyond that, some of the inlay, the inlay that is put in place to give you the design of the sunburst. It's basically made up of 1/8-inch thick pieces of both good old American black walnut, a very common wood here in Virginia, and also good old Virginia tulip poplar, another very, very common wood. When I first did the wood ID and discovered that part of the wavy rays and certainly most of the circular face of the sounding board was tulip poplar, I was kind of taken aback, because tulip poplar, if you know anything about tulip poplar, you know that it's not considered to be a really, really good cabinet wood. I mean, it's a great structural wood. It's very, very dimensionally stable. It's very easily worked, but it's not a terribly attractive wood. So that was a real question mark in my mind. Was the tulip poplar even original, or had that been installed at some later date? But it is kind of interesting that the wavy rays and the straight rays, each one of those rays is made up of a piece of tulip poplar and a piece of walnut. And then, as I say, the face is made up of a combination of, that is, the circular face is tulip poplar, but the eyes and most of the features are made up of clear walnut, and the pupils are the only example, the pupils of the eyes, the only wood that's apart from yellow pine, poplar, or walnut, and those appear to be holly, another good Virginia wood. But anyway, when I got the sounding board to my studio and proceeded to do, well, we did a good bit of paint sampling while it was still in place in the church. And it became pretty clear that the yellow pine ground that all the other inlays is placed into had some traces of a kind of an off-white, kind of a cream-colored paint that had not been scraped away. And I should mention that most of the original decoration was long gone. 99% of it was long gone, because the piece had been really, really severely scraped down. When somebody took the white paint off, it's obvious that they didn't even think to, well, concern themselves over whatever might have been there earlier. It was just taken off and scraped down, probably with a glass scraper, and then sanded, so that very, very little of the original decoration survived. There were some areas that in the yellow pine that still had deeply bedded in the grain of the wood this kind of off-white or cream color paint. So we knew that was the ground color. That same color is on the cornice. You see a dark cornice now, but that dark color of the cornice is a function of probably the 1880s, 1890s, something like that, when real dark colors for woodwork became very, very popular. But it's pretty clear that the earlier paints on the cornice itself were that same sort of off-white or cream color.
Right. And were you able to estimate about how many layers of finish were put on over the years?
Yeah, after the paint had been scraped off the main part of the sounding board, there was probably at least 4 or 5 different campaigns of varnish and stain put on the surface. And what's interesting is that the tulip poplar sections, they actually had stained with a stain that made the tulip poplar darker than the walnut. So it really did detract from any appreciation or understanding of what the sunburst was intended to look like originally. I liken it to a photographic negative. They almost reversed what the colors would have been originally by staining the tulip poplar very dark at that time. So it was very, very difficult to read the face. You could see that there were some pieces of inlay in there that were intended to suggest the lips and the nose and so forth, but you couldn't really make out exactly how they were supposed to, how the viewer was supposed to read those elements the way it had been stained.
And tell me, process from start to finish, including the research, how long did it take you to complete the project?
Several months. I mean, we did an initial paint analysis, taking samples while the sounding board was still in situ, and was able to take those samples and look at them under my own microscope. And I also made use of the was granted permission to use the facilities at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. The conservators there were very interested in this project, and they allowed me to use their microscope as well. So we were able to do some fluorescence microscopy. We definitely proved with the microscopy that indeed the yellow pine had that cream color. We were able to look at the walnut, and my assumption all along was that a good cabinet wood like walnut would have been intended to be seen as a clear finished wood, and was 99% certain of that. But the tulip poplar still threw us for a loop, because I had trouble finding any evidence initially of what had been on the tulip poplar. And it was after several months, doing microscopy, working with the piece, that I happened to pass by the sounding board when the sun was kind of low in the sky, and I saw a glint, just a tiny, tiny little glint in a few little places on the tulip poplar, one of the rays of the tulip poplar. And I looked really closely, and boy, it was really gleaming gold. And it was amazing that, it took that long to see that. But I would say far less than 1% gold left. I mean, much, much less. Because the gold that survived on the tulip poplar rays was just gold that was embedded deep in some of the pores of the tulip poplar. So they had scraped down the surface, but a few of these pores were sufficiently deep that the gold was retained in those pores. And anyway, just seeing the gold there and it glinting through these 4 layers of varnish, it was pretty clear to me that it had to be gold. I mean, there's very few other materials no other material that has that sort of gleam. But I did some more microscopy, not so much taking samples, but taking photomicrographs of these locations. And under magnification, didn't take huge magnification about 40 times to 100 times, you could see clearly that this was gold leaf. You could see that the leaf itself was folded back on itself from the cleaning process, that the leaf was applied over an earlier ground, some sort of a painted ground, suggesting that it was probably an oil gilt surface. And as I say, there's was no doubt in my mind that I was looking at gold. But in order to prove conclusively, and scientifically, I decided it would be good to bring in some instrumentation to do a study of these gilt surfaces. At this time, the sounding board was still in situ. So I again worked with the conservators at the Virginia Museum, who have a really wonderful little device that enables them to do a technique called X-ray fluorescence, which you use to look at heavy metals and other materials like gold. You can basically determine conclusively by the way the X-rays reflect off of the surface of these materials. The particular angle of refraction can determine what materials are present. We tried that first at the church, and we didn't have any luck. And I think it's partly because the samples were so small. That is, even in a dime-shaped sample that this X-ray fluorescence device looks at, you were looking at a sliver of gold that was far less than 1% of the surface that we're looking at. We tried again with the sounding board at the Virginia Museum, and again ran into some difficulties. Consequently, since we were never able to prove conclusively that we had gold using the X-ray fluorescence, when I did the treatment, I actually masked off those areas. We didn't remove the varnish from those areas. Those areas are still intact, so that as they improve these techniques, I think we'll be able to go back at some later date and prove definitively that it's gold. I would say that I'm 99.5% certain that we've got gold there. But as I say, you know, as a conservator, it would really be nice to have that analysis to
Sure.
prove conclusively that that's what it is.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully post-pandemic down the road, we will be able to continue the study. Carrie, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. This has been really interesting. Please visit our website at www.historicstjohnschurch.org to find the first interview that I had with Carrie on the sounding board, and all of our other programs are there as well. Thank you, Carrie, so much this afternoon for your time. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Amy. It was a pleasure.